people who will be most benefited by this are the people who oftentimes have to spend huge amounts of money on inelastic goods, essentials such as egg, bread, milk, which oftentimes massively increase in price because of the fact that inflation means that you have to increase the cost, or other external factors means that you have to raise the cost, such as competition. These are the people who are going to be benefited. The first thing I want you to note is that you should not be bogged down with the economic analysis which is likely to come from opening opposition or closing opposition, but instead think about the way that this does meaningfully benefit the poor people. Even if it does mean that the Tesco itself becomes slightly less efficient, it still means that people are able to access cheaper goods, and that is something that you should weigh quite highly in this debate. Firstly, on the model, I would just note that we would transfer this to the state. We would purchase shares in the business to ensure that people are compensated who currently own it, and it should be able to ensure that they're able to invest their money into other assets, like other profitable assets, in ways that don't mean that they're completely fucked by this nationalisation. And the third thing would be is that it probably happens over a degree of time. So maybe initially we buy 40%, then we go to 51%, then we go to 60%, but the ultimate game is likely 100%. Why is it likely going to be run well? The first reason is that it is likely passed to civil servants, which means that it's constantly run by the same degree of experts and is not subject to the same whims that comes with changing government or changing budgets, because at least there's some degree of permanence when it comes to it. It's likely going to be run in the same way that current nationalised industries run as well. But secondly, the government who does this, which is probably the Labour government, probably needs to justify the action that it takes, or want to ensure that it does not go bust, which means that they probably allocate a vast amount of resources, like civil servant resources, to this to ensure that it is something that does well. But secondly, it won't be privatised or re-privatised, and there are two reasons for this. The first thing is that it's quite hard to re-privatise an industry and get people to want to buy it, but the second thing is just that the things that we're going to do to Tesco will mean that in order to privatise it, again, you have to sell it at a loss, which is something that no government will want to do, and the reason you'll have to sell it at a loss is that you'll have to like functionally ensure that it becomes incredibly profitable, and so you have to put in high amounts of cost into it in this instance in the first place. But the final thing I want to note is that they currently have huge amounts of revenue and huge amounts of stock, which will ensure that we're okay in this transitory period. And the reason for this is that Tesco has huge amounts of customer loyalty associated with the things like the club card, but also it oftentimes upcharges luxury goods such as chicken wine or like Sensations crisps, which means that they pay very small amounts for it, but it means that there's huge amounts of money that they keep in the reserves that they have access to, which we can use to fund the transitionary period. The case is incredibly simple. Firstly, that there are just like objectively good things that happen with the nationalisation, which we're going to fiat in, but then secondly also why this means that nationalisation lowers grocery prices across the board, meaning that any poor people are able to buy more and have more meaningful choice as well. Firstly then, why nationalisation is good. One, it corrects for food deserts. The first thing I want to do here is explain why oftentimes stores only open in profitable areas. These are grocery stores such as Sainsbury's, Tesco, Asda, Aldi. There are a few reasons for this. One, they only operate in like city areas or high places with high foot traffic, like high streets and stuff like that, because of three reasons. One, because and don't get bogged down with cities, because I've debated these two twice now. They're going to try to strawman us. It is just that you go to places where there are high amounts of foot traffic. The first reason for this is that oftentimes this is where you get the most amount of return because of the foot traffic. So people going by there every day will now just go into a Tesco or go into a Sainsbury's because that's where one exists. But secondly, it means that there's high amounts of input costs because you need to set up elsewhere. So I'm from a tiny town called Stamford. There are no supermarkets outside of one little area because it means that there's huge amounts of money which need to be put in to set up this in other sides of the city. This literally is true. They're all on one street. The third thing is that supply. Actually, I'm going to take the POI because if you're honestly going to waste a POI and ask me about Stamford, please.
Okay, my parents also live in Stamford, and Stamford has like a bunch of grocery stores. So you undercut the small businesses to benefit the nationalised one, right?
Yeah, and we're fine with benefiting the nationalised one because people are because the smaller businesses which are privately owned oftentimes have to be more expensive because they don't benefit from the same supply chains that grocery stores do. So even if you undercut them, that likely just means that people are able to benefit this more. But also you need to prove why most people go to those private ones, which is probably quite difficult. But the third and final reason that they set up in places with high foot traffic is because of the fact that these supply chains to these places already exist. So there's already established roads and infrastructure going into these areas, which most supermarkets want to benefit from. Importantly, it means that supermarkets where they do exist is not always accessible to everybody, but also because of the fact that it's expensive to cross-subsidize, it's very expensive to set them up in other places that make them more accessible. So in small towns, it means that it's in the other side of the town, or it's in a different community town where you need to travel to, or if you live in an incredibly rural area, oftentimes it means that you need to do huge amounts of offsetting in order to access them. This is bad for a few reasons. One, because it means that costs go up for people because they have to pay more for transport to get to these things, or because they have to pay for other things such as like delivery fees that come with it, or they can't access it, or they're limited in terms of choice choice because they have to go to private stores like farm stores and things like that, which oftentimes have an expensive cost because they don't benefit from the existing supply lines, the existing established economies of scale that supermarkets do. How do we correct for this? The first way we correct for this is that the government can cross-subsidize with other funds to ensure that it's popular. So Tesco, which currently gives all of its profits to its shareholders, can just input this into cross-subsidization. We do just fiat this in. Like, we will just say that the government, in order to nationalise, will have to set up Tesco's in other places, and the way in which they'll do that is any profit that would go to shareholders is now refunneled into cross-subsidization, which means already you fix a problem about food deserts, making it way more accessible. But secondly, it means that the profit from and so that just means that there's like more stores. The second thing is that we set a maximum price for those products that are considered necessities in the same way that the French do it. So I don't know if this is actually true, but Cyrus said that the French have like a cap on what you can charge for a baguette. We would just do that for anything within the UK, eggs, bread, milk. They would all be capped at a certain price, which means you cannot charge in a Tesco for more than this. Why is it currently incredibly expensive? There are two reasons. Firstly, on inelastic demand for essentials, which means that this is where these stores can make the highest margin of return because they know that people will always need these things, so they upcharge these quite a lot because they can make the highest profit from them in the first place. But secondly, demand is increasing, so those who produce are trying to increase the supply, but the problem is there's a lag before the supply can adjust, which means that everybody in this room is chasing like 5 eggs, and so they can outbid each other in this way as well. And so what's likely going to happen is Cyrus is going to fuck us all because he probably has more money than the rest of us. How do we correct this? The first reason is that the government sets a maximum fare, which it does with buses, so it's intuitive to believe that this happens. But secondly, it's still likely to be profitable for purchasers because the market in other stores will be captured, so it's not like they want to move from a Tesco to a Sainsbury's because Sainsbury's already has its own supply chain. But secondly, excess profits go back to shareholders are now just refunneled in. And they have a huge amount of money to do this. They've got huge existing infrastructure bases, such as club card users, who will constantly pick the Tesco, but also they market up a lot of luxuries which they can now allocate elsewhere. The final thing I want to do quickly is explain why Tesco being nationalised lowers all grocery prices. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, setting a lower price means that others need to do that in order to not hemorrhage clientele because they will need to reduce their prices to ensure that you don't go from Sainsbury's to Tesco. Secondly, because you correct for food desert, it also means that now these products are way more accessible. So now it means that established supermarkets that are not nationalised will need to try to not lose their bases back, which likely means that you try to undercut Tesco as well. You already see this with Asda or Aldi, who promise you returns if you can prove that your product is cheaper at another store. The criticism you may have is, why does this not mean that customers default to other established stores? The first reason for this is brand loyalty that comes with the club card, but secondly, it means that location oftentimes means that you pick that one. The margin here is where you have a meaningful choice. Given this means that you choose the cheaper one, and that benefits more people.
I thank Prime Minister and for the EUDU Robbed session.
So Tesco is probably one of the largest employers of any company in this country, right? And using it as your vanity project to try and undercut every single other grocery chain to have lower prices than all of the rest of them just causes massive market shocks. You create huge inefficiencies in Tesco itself and in the rest of the market. People's grocery prices go up in the long term as these locations shutter and the government becomes unable to maintain it, and everyone is damaged by it. One piece of framing at the top, as in, the way in which you're going to do this is one of two ways. Either the government is going to purchase the shares of Tesco and the locations of Tesco at market value, probably higher than market value, in order to give some incentive for the individuals who own stocks in Tesco and are on the board of it to actually do this deal, which is a tremendous amount of government money that has to come out of a budget that is already constrained and has a ballooning amount of debt, which means it's unlikely the UK government's able to do this without taking out more debt and taking away its ability to spend these things on other necessary services and taking away its purchasing power in essentially every other remit, because more and more of your budget has to go towards servicing the debt, which is probably to the tune of $45–50 billion in this case. Second thing you might do is just erase the money from society, so just like grab it as a matter of policy, as in write a law that says Tesco now belongs to the UK government. I mean, this would be tremendously damaging because, first of all, it's a massive damage to the banks and the markets in which this capital currently exists. They all have a massive shortfall and these people can't recover from it. Second thing is it's a huge chilling effect, as in if you are a business who wants to do operations in the UK or wants to do food supply chains in the UK, you probably don't trust as much the suppliers or the individuals to whom you are supplying in the UK insofar as you're worried about intervention from the government. You know that. So why does, in either of these scenarios though, why does this ultimately lead to market destruction? And most of this is going to implicitly flip mechanisms that we get from open government. And I want to start with noting that status quo is actually quite good in terms of food costs, as in it's the best we can sort of do in a free market. So they say that status quo is that food is an inelastic good and therefore prices tend to be quite high. I think this is just patently untrue, as in there's a tremendous amount of competition in this country for food prices, as in if you don't go to Tesco's, you'll go to Spar, or you go to Sainsbury's, or I guess you'll go to Waitrose, it's a little pricier. But there's just a zillion different like local sort of small institutions that are able to compete directly with each other on prices and directly with each other for the same products. So they already have huge incentives to keep prices low to begin with, and oftentimes this is why you see like stores setting up their own brands like Tesco Plus, where you sell pasta for 68 cents for a pound, all that kind of stuff, which means that you have a tremendously low prices to begin with. So that undercuts most of the mechanisms about prices. So, but the presumption and the concession that they make is that, sure, we're willing for these institutions to make less money if it provides a public good. But it's not clear that if you make that concession, if you presume that you make less money, you're actually able to maintain most of these outlets in the long term. As in, how do you pay the wages of the workers? How do you bid for goods? As in, if you still need to buy eggs to sell eggs at a lower price, how are you going to purchase the eggs at the price at which the supplier is forced to make them? These become tremendously difficult at the point to which, one, you are already making less money, and therefore the government has to take out more and more debt to finance this. And secondly, the demand for eggs and bread at Tesco's goes through the roof, as in every single individual in the country will stop shopping at Sainsbury's, will stop shopping at Spar, and will buy all of their eggs and all of their bread from Tesco's, which creates a tremendous amount of like supply chain stress, specifically on this company, and specifically on the supply chains that supply it, which means that the government becomes more and more in the hole, and in the long term becomes less and less able to fund this project. This means a few impediments. It means, first of all, the other companies in this model are tremendously undercut on price, and therefore, in order to do what they say, to lower their prices towards what Tesco is now offering, they have to make these concessions themselves. But they don't have the government backing them, as in they don't have the ability to reach into public debt to finance their losses on these items, right? So more and more of these shops shut down. In the places they talk about, these food deserts, now if a Tesco shows up, it becomes impossible for your local mom and pop grocery or any other institution of competition to exist in these areas. So paradoxically, your inability to sell at the prices that Tesco does means that ultimately you end up with a monopoly of Tesco's, presumably in the worst off regions, and these things are the most likely to result in food deserts as supply chains become stressed and egg sellers and bread sellers are not able to meet the demand that is placed on them for Tesco's and are actually end up making less money because the alternative suppliers are no longer bidding for them alongside Tesco, but Tesco is winning all those bids and is offering a lower price to suppliers. So there's a tremendous amount of shocks both to the individuals who are employed in the other stores, the individuals who are employed by Tesco's, the communities that rely on these individuals' wages, and the supply chains themselves who now get tremendously lower prices on the products they produce. So if you're a farmer, you make a lot less money. I'll take those.
Can you quickly explain why a monopoly for Tesco is bad?
Monopolies are bad because there's less competition for prices. If the status quo is there's lots of competition for prices, that means that it's artificially driven down. If it's monopoly on Tesco's, that probably means that there are fewer jobs available, as in there are just less and less Tesco locations, because everyone has to finance each individual one of them, which leads to a downwards pressure on wages. If individuals earn less money, the country as a whole becomes economically less productive. Okay, let's say that you are successful though. You undercut all other individuals. You then have a major disruption to labor and supply chains. The food deserts get worse. You undercut local businesses. So if the underlying issue, though, is the cost of food, the ultimate thing the government is going to have to prove in this debate is that you can solve this issue, that you can throw enough money at it to make it in the long term profitable to supply these things at low prices. So if it's still just as expensive to produce eggs, still as expensive to produce pasta and bread and meat in this country, that just means that it becomes even worse at the point to which there is now less competition as Tesco takes up more and more of these contracts on these prices, and it becomes much more difficult to even get into the industry in the first place. No, thank you. Secondly, on long-term destruction, this is just a simple stock case as to why state-owned enterprises are bad and the private market tends to do things better. As in, if you are the state-owned enterprise, your incentives are not towards making your company profitable in the long term. Your incentives are towards the democratic situation of every country. The reason why this is bad is that in order to maintain your industry, you have to increase your government debt or to do things in a way that is inefficient but politically popular, which means that it's run by bureaucrats who are not, these are not especially attractive jobs. You don't earn a lot of money from it. So the individuals with the most institutional knowledge tend not to take these jobs. On the comparative in the private market, you have CEOs who have long-termist reputational goals, who work for multiple companies, and if their situation ends up worse when they join a company worse after they've led a company than it was before it, they suffer in the long term in terms of their job prospects. They also have the most institutional knowledge, and oftentimes are promoted and hired from within or from rival companies. The impact of this is simple. It's that you run these companies the most efficiently as possible. And this may seem like a boring mech. They want you to lose a bunch of money to sell bread at really low prices. But the impact of this, I already flipped it in the first point. The impact of this is that there's a tremendous amount of money lost in the economy. And if you run this inefficiently, the people who are hurt by it are the same people that they try to benefit. The ones who work in these communities that rely on things like supply chains, that rely on people to ship products towards these companies. If they're run inefficiently, two things happen. Jay will say what the two things are.
You're Robbed, and I followed by the impact of Australia.
Opening opposition asks us where all of the extra money is coming from to reduce prices. But I have a better question for them. Right now, where is all of that extra money going? It turns out it goes back into the shareholders' pockets of Tesco and not in improving the experience for the consumers themselves. Because the whole point of the corporation in the private model is that all of the excess profit you take off the top, which is high, because all of the good reasons that Josh gave you about why Tesco can charge high margins on their products right now, means that all of that excess is going not to the people who are buying the groceries, but to the consumer, to the shareholders who actually then benefit from that profit. So obviously, the extra money comes most chiefly from that profit, those existingly high margins that now go into reducing prices, as opposed to going back to the shareholders themselves. We think that's how you get the extra money that you need in order to actually reduce prices overall. But the second thing I'll note on this extra money coming from Point is the cost of sedation that already Josh brings to you, because this part of it is completely free on our side of the house. We charge more in major metropolitan areas, in rich areas of London, and we therefore can open new stores elsewhere where there isn't anything existingly. That's just cross-subsidizing losses without actually changing the overall price. Similarly, we will charge less for necessities and more for high-value goods in Tesco's themselves, because generally that's when inflation hits hardest. These things are free. Let's go through a little bit of opening opposition and then explain why this is run just really, really well. The first thing they talk about is small businesses. But I think existingly, mom and pop shops just don't meaningfully compete with these big corporations in terms of supermarkets. One, because they appeal to a different consumer who cares about organic $5 loaves or otherwise about products that aren't the same as those that happen in major supermarkets. Two, because there's a different niche that they fill overall, as in it's those people who want artisan goods, and also generally speaking, they're not selling the same sort of products anyway. And three, and really importantly, those mom and pop shops that are genuinely like suppliers themselves, like think about farmer stands that sell eggs, are usually really cheap because there are no middlemen, so they can sell direct to consumer. Insofar as they can do that, they can compete with the prices of the big guys. So those guys are totally fine because they have that advantage in the first place. I don't think mom and pop shops are really meaningful. Actually think about the last time you went and bought your local shopping every single week at a mom and pop little grocery store. What that does mean then is that you do have lots of competition, at least in theory, between the various different supermarket chains in the UK. But it turns out that actually this oligopoly does not achieve the competition that they needed to in order to reduce prices, because it is in everyone's interest, as in every individual supermarket interest, to not shift prices down. Because there are so few of them, this solution works really easily, even if it isn't actively being done. As it just means that nobody is going to reduce their prices to undercut others in those contexts, because every corporation knows it's individually in their best interest to not do the individual actions. Whereas, when the public, that is the state, gets involved, then all of a sudden people do have to react to those price shifts because they do actually happen. I'll note here also that it's really easy to not reduce prices even when you can, because you can always show, well, the rising cost of living and inflation means that our costs cost more too. It's really easy to justify not reducing prices even when you can. So no, competition doesn't solve the problem in status quo. Anyone who's been in a grocery store can tell you, no, this actually is not, we aren't currently doing the best we can do, as Rob says. Lastly, they talk a little bit about the debt you take out to do this. And yeah, we think this is fine. It's really normal. It happens every single time you nationalize an industry. You gradually buy shares until you have your 51%. We think that's fine. And your future cash flows from the project let you take this out in the first place. That is, the revenue makes it easy to actually do so. Let's talk a little bit about why this has run well and beat the stock case that they give. But first of all, go for it.
Yeah, your shareholder margins don't work in the long term, because the reason why shareholder margins exist right now is because prices are high and those are reinvested. Over time that reduces, so you can't subsidize in the way you say over time.
Yes, because right now all of the profits go somewhere else. So yes, you're still making some amount of profit. The point is that the prices go down. So yes, if the prices are down, you make less profit, because the whole reason that we don't care is because we have the profits. Like I think we're saying the same thing. We think that it's totally reasonable to use profits for that as opposed to like anything else. Let's explain why this is run really well. First, on political accountability, because it's very easy to say in debates like this that nobody cares how well the nationalist industry is run because they're voting on other things. But it turns out that grocery store prices is exactly what people know about it, and all political parties actually know this too, as in everyone cares about accessibility and prices and inventory for groceries. So insofar as any of the problems that they say do occur, then surely it's very easy for little parties to say, indeed, we don't have nearly the inventory that we need, and therefore we're going to actually fix this problem, because that's a big voter issue that actually likely to save those sorts of problems. And here I want to be really clear. If the UK public decide that they want to use their taxpayer dollars to reduce prices at grocery stores, even at the expense of the efficiency of those grocery stores, we say, fine, that's absolutely their right. And the whole point of nationalism in industry is that it's actually vested in the power of the British public to make those own sorts of calls. If that's something that they feel really strongly, we have absolutely no right to say anything otherwise. We think it's pretty reasonable for people to think that actually the prices of their groceries ought matter to them most, as opposed to the overall efficiency of your operation. But second, on long-termism, this is another reason it's run well. Because Tesco currently is publicly traded, so it has an obligation to current shareholders that usually happens in quarterly windows. Like you need to prove to your shareholders every quarter that you're doing well and your earnings in this individual bit of revenue. But that means that you're likely to do things like maximize the trends and short-term value of your fare in the first place. So it's like why there are tons of Dubai chocolate things that are left in Tesco stands, because they were a really big trend, which is advantageous like 3 quarters ago, but now in 2026, that isn't nearly advantageous. Whereas, when Tesco is instead publicly owned rather than traded, then the parties that run this individual operation care a lot about their legacy as a party, about being a party that did well with this nationalized grocery store, and therefore it means that they do have long-termist interests. Even if they, as an individual politician, aren't in power for very long, their party makes sure that they run it well so they continue to have that legacy. So on long-termism, I think actually we're much more efficient side opening opposition. C then on favorable supply chain bilateralism. And what I mean here is that imagine if you're a banana farmer in Central America who's selling to a UK supermarket. When Tesco gets nationalized, you want to give more favorable deals to curry favor with the British government, A, and B, to beat out competitor suppliers for this new gargantuan that's rising up. So they're right, probably you do achieve economies of scale on our side of the house, but that's a good thing, because now you're buying in larger bulk, so you get better deals with your suppliers than you would have got otherwise, because now people actually want to curry favor with this massive nationalized industry that didn't exist beforehand. So actually means that you get better deals, and therefore your costs overall go down. Again, it means that you can reduce prices. Lastly, on risk and counterbalance, which is like Tesco right now has to hedge against large losses that might happen, whereas the UK government has much more ability to do so. I want to weigh this case out, because ultimately we've been really clear that ultimately that we're going to protect the most vulnerable groups in Britain. That means A, those in rural areas, the food deserts that have indeed cropped up everywhere, because it doesn't make financial sense for grocery stores to open there. And this isn't like the rich town that Rob's parents live in, it's like all of the other rural areas that actually don't have access to these same kind of things. And B, it's people everywhere who are buying only necessities, which we clearly characterize are the places where the inflation hits first. These people are the ones who can't afford heating, or preschool so they can't work, or emergencies if they ever accrue. So reducing their largest weekly overhead every single week means that they can actually achieve the things they want to in their lives. These are the people we all care about most in the debate, because they're the ones who are struggling and bearing the hurt the most. And also because there are a lot of them, as in there are lots of people in these rural areas who are currently underfunded, and therefore we ought to care about them the most. Insofar as that is the largest problem in the debate, if those are the people that we can save the most, ultimately then that should be the most certain impact of the debate, and you should vote for opening government.
Thank Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of Opposition.
during December, me and my team pitched B&M, one of the closest competitors to Tesco. So let me give you the actual market research with structural reasons first, and let's rebuild what Rob gives you, which is why government is comparatively worse. There is a huge opportunity cost, which gets supercharged by everything Cyrus gives you, and hence is just better and win on both the metrics of cost and efficiency. But first of all, what is the market in status quo? The market has already expanded. Tesco is literally the largest number of stores in the entirety of the country and stuff like that, for two reasons, right? First, there's a first mover advantage. If you're the first grocery store in a small town, you get everyone in the small town to come buy your groceries, which means there's a strategic advantage, especially if they concede that there's a degree of loyalty for people to go into it in the first place. Secondarily, there is diminishing returns in cities, right? Things that are further away, like if two Tesco's are one street away from each other, the problem is everyone would just rather go to one of them, and then you don't need the second one. So you're more likely to disperse it around all across the country so you get more consumers, because people go to the closest grocery store they have. And if the closest one is a Tesco, and the second closest one is also a Tesco, there's no point in the second one in the first place. The second market thing that's happening is the margins are razor thin for 4 different reasons. First of all, just competitive analysis. Aldi literally is priding themselves for like price cutting, right? Their entire market is that they have super low prices. They have 28p pasta. They have like super low plus eggs and all the other things. I literally go shop there. People are super price sensitive. And for new companies to come into the market, like Asda, like Lidl, like Iceland, all of these guys also prioritize themselves in lowering the cost because that is the greatest way to attract consumers. It's not loyalty, it's price. Secondarily, people are highly price sensitive, right? If eggs are too expensive, people just don't buy them fundamentally. There are a huge amount of like goods that are less like valuable or like less efficient in terms of like super low cost, low quality goods that people will opt into if they have the option to. And they will because they don't have wages, they don't have income in the first place. Third of all, there's a huge amount of political scrutiny. When they raised meal deal prices this year, everyone like was super angry, super outraged, a huge amount of political backlash. There's a social media scrutiny, things like that. And finally, like they're largely contingent on fixed supply costs, which means that like if the farmers go, each egg is worth £1, Tesco would sell them for £1.10. They'll cut a small amount of razor thin margins at the bottom to get the money, precisely because this is a very thin margin industry. It's a very competitive industry. It's also an industry where consumers are hugely price sensitive because there's the ones which have relatively low income in the first place, which means they often, if they can't afford to buy 2 cartons of eggs, you're forced to buy 1. That's a huge amount of cost that they're unable to afford in the first place. What does Rob tell you? Rob was telling you the act of engaging in this is really, really bad. Because like, when I researched this, the market cap of Tesco's is $40 billion. And if Cyrus is right, which the shareholders get huge amounts of money, you probably have to pay them way more than $40 billion for them to shake over like a large cap of something that's hugely profitable in the long run, which means you're likely to like you have to pay them significantly more to take over 40, 50, 60% of shareholders to get the CEO with this amazing cushy job, with this amazing amount of profit incentives to go, no, you are now we're going to undercut all your prices, we're going to make it super not profitable in the first place, right? So this is really, really problematic. But secondarily, why is the government just comparatively significantly worse? I think he's already explained to you sufficiently on why it's super expensive to have inefficiencies. But just the idea of Tesco's being set up means that they're unlikely to close down if it's not for profit incentives, because it's very bad for your local small Tesco to suddenly shut down because it's not profitable, which means a bunch of inefficient Tesco's will continue to exist and siphon a large amount of the money from the government themselves because there's no other accountability mechanism. But secondarily, there is huge political short-term volatility because as they concede, people hugely care about Tesco, people hugely care about food prices. What is the likely manifestation is that every time a political party goes, they say, we'll give $100 billion more to Tesco, we'll lower the prices every single election cycle. But obviously, this is not something that's sustainable in the long run, which means food prices will go up and down as the other market competitors are supposed to cater to like the actual industry, which is Tesco, from a government that is highly short-termist and highly incentivized to get a lot of popularity on immediate things, which is prices in the first place. Third of all, there is just bureaucracy. In a cutthroat market, you cannot afford delays and years to push new policies, years to push price changes, years to push price hikes and things like that. Obviously, that means that they'll get even more unprofitable as the prices become even more fixed, because as they concede, the government is held accountable, and the government does not want prices to increase, but inflation is happening and will continue to happen. The final reason on why the government is comparatively worse is their leaders are not proximate. In the status quo, why do the leaders of Tesco care about Tesco? Because they have shares in the company. What happens when they don't have shares in the company? Because all this money is refunneled back into the industry themselves to cross-subsidize, as they say. The leaders don't care, or they're unable to be compensated as much. So the best and most successful and the smartest leaders don't go into them. panel, I think you have to be very clear in why these leaders itself is hugely important, because they're individually able to come up with ideas that turn the companies around. B&M, the company we literally pitched, was solely because the leader had a new policy that overruled the supply chain system and allowed for profitable mechanisms. I think that's really, really important. Before I talk about opportunity cost, Josh.
Can you please give one literal reason why one of the wealthiest countries in the world taking on more debt is bad?
Okay, perfect. Here are 3 reasons why that is really, really bad. First of all, it constrains future investment, right? The trade-off here is that you're now having a $40 billion asset in your portfolio, which means when it's highly volatile, which equities tend to be significantly more than bonds and stuff like that, because they're subjected to supply shocks, they're subjected to the whims of the market, they're subjected to arbitrage opportunities for consumers. The things like that mean it's hugely more risky to invest in the UK because they're not exposed to the entirety of Tesco, which is a $40 billion company that fell 50% from 2011 to 2013. This is really, really bad because what constrains is that increased risk demands increased interest rates, which means you allow for the government to not be able to borrow at a large scale on literally everything. And secondarily, there's just huge amounts of volatility, which means the market itself hugely flip-flops around. It's really, really bad because obviously you need that to pay for literally everything you invest in the first place. Secondarily, I think there's a huge trade-off in opportunity cost, because the trade-off is things like cutting food banks, like healthcare, education, things like that. Because the government concedes that there's a disproportionate large amount of interest onto food prices, things like that. Because the government, if having ownership of this, will vet a disproportionately large amount of money into Tesco, which means they trade off a huge amount of other different components in the first place. 3 final responses on long-termism. So first of all, investors care more about long-termists because they're less immediate and visceral. The average voter cares about the current prices. Investor cares about the entire long-term Tesco trend. Investors are also more informed because it's literally either their jobs or they think they're smarter because they do market research in the first place. And investors are also more educated, right? You come out like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and stuff like that. You have more information at your hand. You're more engaged with the consumers. You can call the people at Tesco and find out what's going on. The average political individual probably doesn't. Finally, the cross-subsidization point also doesn't work because cities are the ones with the highest level of competition, which means they're the one with the lowest amount of margin. So if you raise prices at cities, these people will just go to Sainsbury's next door because there's easy alternatives, which means Tesco is constrained in their price, especially in cities, which means that they're unable to cross-subsidize because the prices are fixed to Aldi, which is continuously undercutting prices, as shown by what they've been doing in the last 20 years.
I think that maybe your organization of course
When did you get the second?
I bought it from Romania after LSE opened because she was like, I should see shit. Okay. Our case is going to be very simple. We're just going to explain as to why over the long term supply chains get fucked. This means farmers get fucked, and that means all the people who work for farmers in mills, in their houses, all get fucked, which is really bad for the UK economy. The first thing I'll explain is why it is impossible to run these businesses sustainably over time in the ways opening government wants to talk about, and as a result, Tesco is forced to do price cutting in really problematic ways, which actually harm a lot of people. The 2 things opening government says about why it is possible is firstly, that you can reinvest the shareholder money back into the business. They say that the large amount of money is profitable right now, and all of that money is going to be pooled and utilized to reinvest back into the Tesco's over time so they can be run sustainably. The first problem with this is a short-term solution, right? The reason why there's high margins right now is because there's high prices for majority of those goods. Insofar as you reduce prices, you don't have that pool of money available to you anymore in order to do that reinvestment. So at best it is short-term, it is unclear as to why that is sustainable. But the more important problem, not right now, is that majority of the profitability of Tesco or any other supermarket is through luxury goods. Because smaller goods aren't profitable per se, because those margins are really small. We don't know why the government-run Tesco is going to do production of luxury goods, right? Like, why are they going to do like shit like, I don't know, like, what the fuck the like Tesco luxury goods look like mince pies for 10 quid? Like, why the fuck would they continue to do that? Because poor people aren't going for mince pies, they need bananas, they need milk, they need bread. So I don't know why the supermarket is going to run and make those profitable things in the first place, right? And the really important thing here is that's where the biggest margins come from. So when you don't have the luxury goods that you have in the first place, you don't lose that margin. But in addition to that, you can't compete with those things, right? Even if they want to say they can have it. Because in order to do luxury goods, you need to have quality. And the other supermarkets are willing not to compromise on quality because they're willing to spend more because they can upcharge, right? So even if you, in the best case, do these luxury goods, you can't actually sustainably make those and get a market for them because you run out of money in the first place. What then does the government do? Opening opposition says they're going to take on debt. And the problem with this claim is this is not empirically possible, right? Right now the UK is going through a debt hole, and that means both Labour and Conservatives and like Reform, etc. are incredibly fiscally conservative. So it's unclear as to why debt is the most likely reaction to the cost-cutting measures that will be taken. We think there are two possible likely scenarios. The first one I think is the most harmful, and that is reduction of prices across the supply chain. What does this look like on the ground? So imagine a banana seller. He has a ton of 1 million tons of banana, and they're the biggest supplier of bananas like from one region. What the government does now is they reduce the unit cost price of the banana seller largely because they have to find a way to sustainably run this business, right? So then, for example, if they charge like 10 pounds per kilo, they reduce it to 5 pounds. And this is really, really problematic for these banana sellers. Maybe opening government says, closing government says, oh, well, how will they do this? Where does the capacity exist? Two mechanisms for this. The first reason is that they're the fucking government. They can do regulations on price capping. If they can do price caps on their end, on the consumer price, they can also do price caps on our end with regards to how purchases happen. But the simpler one, intuition is just Tesco has market cap, right? They're going to be 40% of the market. The banana seller doesn't want to lose 40% of the market. So they obviously agree to the prices because the government has greater negotiating leverage, right? So obviously the banana seller is like, okay guys, if you really want my bananas at 5 pounds, I'll give it to you because otherwise I lose 40% of my supply. 40% of my consumer base, right? So then the banana seller is like, okay guys, okay, let's do this. What happens to the banana seller? The banana seller doesn't sell his bananas alone. He has banana farmers. He has people who do banana warehousing. There are people who drive trucks for the banana seller to transport bananas. Bananas are a really bad example, I just realized. There's no bananas in the UK. Let's just insert vegetable or fruit that UK has. That person has trucks that they need to use. They create large amounts of employment, right? And I also want to outweigh all teams on the degree of employment, right? This is millions of jobs. UK economy is run by these agricultural persons and people who work in this supply chain, right? All of these people get harmed, and this is really problematic. How does this materialize? One, your capacity to pay these people and their wages reduces. So now the insert vegetable person who runs the business cannot pay the trucker the same price. He cannot pay the farmer the same price. So their ability to actually survive reduces massively. How does this interact with opening government first? Their assumption is just because cost price of supermarkets go down, everything is fine. But that doesn't make sense if you don't have wages, right? Because wages are utilized for everything. It is liquidity that is required for things like energy bills. It is required things like healthcare. All of these things are additive costs. So even in the best case, if you reduce supermarket costs, that is not sufficient if you reduce wages as well for people, because wages are liquid that can be utilized for other essentials as well. So you have less capacity to survive as a person in the first place. How does this weigh against opening opposition? Our claim is just simply more empirically possible, right? Because this is how nationalization actually happens. It is not through debt ceiling, right? And the second problem is the response Cyrus gives to opening opposition is that if the debt is sustainable insofar as the economy is growing. So it is unclear as to why debt itself is not sustainable if it's relative to the GDP growth as well, right? Our claim is not it's resilient to this because we don't care if the economy grows if the supply itself cannot charge higher prices. Yeah. This is, I think, just debate in itself, but also against closing government. Closing government discredits closing government's claim on suppliers, right? Because if the suppliers get less money, that goes down the supply chain. Every single person now working in the supply chains gets fucked over. OG, go ahead.
It doesn't engage with Josh's model. We aren't lowering prices below the raw cost of goods.
No, but
like a massive
so your model, the fiat is not magic. fiat only works if it's empirically possible to do so. You don't tell me why it is possible to do so across unit trust, because otherwise you can't make money over time, right? So like it can work, but it is not empirically possible to do so, because otherwise the business is not sustainable. So if you're reducing cost prices at the supermarket, it also has to have a reduction at the supply stage as well, because otherwise it is not sustainable to run the business in the first place. There's also a second likely response that will happen. That is reducing the wage bill of Tesco. Right now, closing government says Tesco hires close to 500,000 people. And the problem right now is those people need to be paid. This looks like managers, this looks like people who are working on minimum wage. It is impossible to pay people over time if you can't make money over time as well, right? Because other costs compound, right? Like like energy cost of the Tesco increases. So that cost increases, that means you can pay like wages less. So the way this like empirically manifests is that if other costs increase because of inflation and things like that, and profitability or like the profit margin stays the same, you can't pay the wages of the same people over time. That is relevant to inflation. So what you are forced to do is you're forced to cut jobs. So closing government's case actually helps us because the wage bill contracts. That means the amount of workers working for Tesco also contract. This is really harmful because a lot of minimum wage workers just lose jobs. All of these reasons, I think closing opposition clearly wins this debate.
I think number of opposition and call sorry, government. Just gonna have next.
Thank you so much. It's not very warm though. I'm getting freezing. Is the panel ready? If everyone is ready, then my time starts now. Okay, so I'm going to start on a few clashes that I think I see with us and OO and CO, and then further move on to discuss the impacts that we have with Nikita's extension, which I do not think that closing opposition has successfully mitigated. So first of all, what we see come out from opening opposition is stuff about market inefficiencies, low prices anyway because of competition. I think OG deals with this pretty well. So I'm just going to talk about one point that I have a problem with, which is create monopoly bad, harm other supermarkets. So I'm actually a really big fan of Sainsbury's. Like my Nectar's points are like actually insane, but I do not think that a monopoly of Tesco is going to be that bad. I'll talk more about this in my impacts on Nikita's extension, but I will also like to add that this is not it's not going to become a private market monopoly. So it's not going to be a monopoly in the sense that we understand with the whole private market thing, because if the motion was this house would monopolize Tesco, that would be very different, right? So OO tells you that wages will go down and wages will go down and food prices will go up. Firstly, Nikita has already megged to you how nationalization will increase living wage and the government has motivation for this, but I will go on to further do this against CO because I think they mentioned this as well. Next, relocated workers from Sainsbury and Waitrose can just take up the new demand in Tesco job posts. And thirdly, I think most importantly, we need to identify why does Tesco fight for profit right now? It is because of competition. This is capitalism 101. If there is no more competition, Tesco has the security that they don't need to make more to make up for the profit that they right now lose to other supermarkets. They will not, unprompted, outprice the entirety of the UK without getting seriously shat on by the public because they can no longer afford the food at Tesco. We just don't believe that this is going to happen. OG also tells you why smaller supermarket owners will not be able to compete anyway, whether or not we nationalize Tesco. And we think that that's completely right. And we would just like to further add on that this, even if it is the case that smaller supermarket owners will be outcompeted, they can't survive anymore, we think that this is a cost that we are willing to sacrifice because this is small marginal impact and small stakeholder group compared to the impacts that GovBench has given to you. So next I would like to move on to CO, and how CO talks about, first of all, the supply chain gets fucked. And Sachin makes a really, really interesting point about how poor people no buy luxury, no luxury good, Tesco no make money. So first of all, Sachin, I think poor people also need protein, right? They also need mincemeat. But secondly, on a more serious note, the mass majority of consumers of this nationalized Tesco are going to be the middle class. And so I think the thing about luxury is that more and more luxury is being promoted to the middle class. This is because we are currently in consumerism final boss. I'll take the point from opening.
The supplier of goods are small and decentralized. It's impossible to have a farm as big as Tesco, right? So they continue to have different markets bargaining for them. The reason grocery store prices are going up is because these farmers have bargaining power. Because if you don't go to Tesco, you go to Sainsbury's, Aldi, Asda, your local corner store. There are so many alternatives. I don't think they can be proved that one of these happens.
But I also think that that's highly speculative, and that's assuming that once Tesco is nationalized, they're gonna be like, all you farmers, like, you can only take me at my price. Like, we just don't, we think that that is an unfair characterization of a nationalized Tesco that is going to have to feed the entirety of the UK, that will have that will have pressure from the public, pressure from the media, pressure from people all around the UK in general. We think that that's highly speculative and a very unfair characterization of what will happen in government's world. So moving on and going back to Sachin's point about Tesco will no longer have luxury. So I think the point that we're trying to make in here is because the majority of the people who will be buying from Tesco ultimately is going to be the middle class. And the thing about luxury is that luxury is sold to the middle class. Luxury is trying to market itself to the middle class. We see this more and more nowadays because we are in consumerism final boss life stage. But basically we see things like people in the middle class saving up more and more money just to splurge on a certain item. And for example, when it comes to Tesco, we see things like Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, wherein supermarkets like Tesco are able to make large amounts of profit from, because people are just willing to splurge in the holidays. There will still be luxuries existing in such supermarkets. But even in the day-to-day, the middle class attempt to be a part of this luxury, and Tesco luxury is the most accessible luxury to the middle class, and like a £10 mincemeat that Sachin brings up is far cheaper than like the cheapest. I'll take it.
Yeah, so our claim is not that you can't market luxuries, but it's so far, in order to make money from luxuries, you have to upcharge. But you can't do that under opening government's model. So that's why you can't make money with luxuries even if you have it for Tesco.
The thing about not making money right now because you have to upcharge is because Tesco right now has competition. And I also have talked about already, if Tesco does not have the competition from Sainsbury like me right now, like I'm giving all my fucking money to Sainsbury, okay? If I gave my money to Tesco, they would be in so much profit right now. But the point being is that because they no longer have these competitions, they no longer need to upcharge their luxury goods in order to be able to make a profit and in order to be able to survive. And next I'm going to move on to start talking about impacts on Nikita's extension. So first of all, I think something that is not dealt with by any other group in this debate is the fact that we point out that there will be control over food supply in times of need. And we think this is the most important because I don't ultimately think what's most important is what gives us like the best foreign investment in the UK, but rather what is the best way that we can deal with our food supply chain in times of need. So what does this look like? Nikita has mechanized already how nationalization allows for the government to control and regulate food supply, manage stocking and distribution. And so this is why and so this plays out in the UK's favor during times of urgency, such as a pandemic or a war, right? So this is really relevant right now when we see like, the outbreak of Menbi and whatever the fuck is happening in the Middle East. Menbi is really fucking scary, guys. And I want to take a real life example. So China had 3 lockdowns, okay, in the past 5 years. I was there for all 3 of them, 2020, 2021, 2022. The only fucking reason I'm still alive right now is because there's one massive supermarket brand that was nationalized in China, and they gave us all of our fucking food and water during the lockdown when we were not allowed to go out of our doors. So I just think that being able to have a nationalized supermarket chain is a very, very good preparation in times of urgency. And next, onto the point that OG makes about removing food deserts, I think they do a really good job of this, and we want to further point out this is really important for suburban middle wage workers. So once nationalized, Tesco in further out areas can continue to stay open, which OZ tells you. And we think that these areas are not unprofitable because no one needs them, but because in suburban areas there's just less population density and Tesco is still hard to come by. But your average blue-collar worker still needs a meal deal before they can commute like 2 hours into the city center. And there's no enough time to afford breakfast at home. And breakfast is obviously the most important meal of the day because Sachin and Meagan were literally staring at their Deliveroo app this morning. I run out of time. Thank you guys.
Brilliant. I thank Dr. Whip and call for Dr. Whip. Here.
The first thing I want to make incredibly clear is the thing that Sachin tells you about how suppliers get fucked. The first thing I'm going to, I guess, reiterate is that this is way above anything that, even if they're able to prove anything about affordability improving, we're able to weigh this above the entire clash and wash out that clash that happens on top half. This also then washes out what CG tells us about how workforce's wages get better because corporate owners have less social welfare incentives than governments, and you can directly campaign governments to lower wages for cashiers and things like that. The reason why the supply chain claim weighs over all of this is that the vast majority of the poor and vulnerable people that we care about work in the supply chain. They work in the farms and the warehouses and the transport, the truck drivers, the manual workers who unload the imports from Chile that come in through the ports. These are the vast majority of the working class people that we care about. So if you want to weigh this on the metric of affordability for vulnerable people that all governments seem to care this much about, we access the highest scale and the highest vulnerability of these working class blue collar workers. OG's response to this is going to be that, oh, but they buy from Tesco though, so at least their purchasing power is higher for necessities like bananas and eggs and whatever, so maybe this mitigates what we tell you. No, because this runs into the stratified consumption explanation that we already give in Sachin's speech, right? Because these people are already buying from competitors such as Aldi and Lidl, because produce is already cheap. I want to make this incredibly clear, because produce is in many of these supermarkets, many times, often already sold at cost price. This is why Aldi and Sainsbury's and even Marks and Spencer's oftentimes sell like eggs and fruit at vaguely the same prices. The issue that the places where there is different in pricing between different supermarket chains is in luxury or branded goods, because they're then able to claim that there's additional value. It's much more difficult to claim that you have added value onto eggs, because all eggs are the same, it's just the same fucking egg. Which is to say then, the metric of the scale of people in the supply chain is also massively outweighs the poor people working as cashiers, stuff that you talk about, especially because a lot of the people that do work in the supply chains are much more sticky and much more difficult to retrain jobs compared to people who work in cashier jobs and restock the shelves in Tesco's and things like that. So again, why do suppliers get fucked? Because OG says it themselves, right? They say that they get better deals in the supply chain, and Tesco buys a lot of the stock. They have a high negotiating power because of what Sachin tells you. OG then says, OG says that the other reason why this is exacerbated is that OG says demand for groceries are inelastic, but in the same way, supply of raw materials is also deeply inelastic because of weather and because of perishability. It's supply that's inelastic, not demand that's inelastic, which is to say that the dent to the margins of the supply chain is massively exacerbated on your side of the house, because when they have to lower their prices in order to cater to the government's demand, when now the government has nationalized their biggest buyer of the produce that they put out, it means that they're less able to recover from supply chain shocks and that kind of thing. OG will also then say in response to this that you use profit margins to lower price, but not have, you use the profit margins to lower price rather than having lower cost reduced prices. The issue is that the profit margin pot that you get in the initial nationalization stage is not infinite, right? Because what they say is that the solvency to affordability, they say, is that you use the money to open more stores and the money comes from the existing profit margins of the corporate owners employers have, but also the aim of nationalization is to eventually lower prices by squeezing the margins. I just don't understand why this isn't intention, because even if you get a pot of money at the beginning, this is not going to last forever, which means that eventually you do have to squeeze your profit margins, which means that eventually you do access the supply chain impacts that Sachin tells to you. This also then damages the government, and this is a much better explanation of backlash than what OO gives you, because people's reaction, people do react and people do respond to affordability. This damages it because the people that are working in the supply chains now have their livelihoods squeezed. The second way in which we're going to respond to what we're told on GovBench, especially from OG, about how accessibility and how grocery stores are opening in places with high foot traffic, and that doesn't happen on our side, is that it's already, again, I think it just doesn't respond to what realistically grocery store opening looks like in the real world, right? Because companies also know the stratification of consumer bases, and that there are some richer areas where Waitroses should open. Waitrose is never going to open in a neighborhood that is plagued with poverty or in rural areas, but Aldi and Tesco and these kinds of places will. The reason why they know this is, again, because it's the nature of oligopolies, right? It's not a monopoly in the sense. The nature of oligopolies in the status quo is to mutually scrutinize, and in some cases, communicate and collaborate with each other. They scrutinize each other because of competitive incentives, but they also collaborate with each other because they need each other to survive. They have collective bargaining power when it comes to the supply chain in these instances, which is saying that the stratification is already happening. This means that what they're telling us, the crux problem that they identify, that both government teams are trying to solve about how affordability is a large issue, just doesn't exist in the first place, because the people that need to buy bare necessities are already buying them at cost price, and are already buying it from bargain supermarkets such as Lidl and Aldi and Asda. I'll take opening quickly.
It's unclear why governments will cut prices by bucking over suppliers instead of cross-subsidizing or eliminating high margins on necessities or any of the other ways we explained, because farmers are such a powerful voting demographic anyway. So a certain impact is money in the pocket of the poorest families.
So first of all, what I say is that there already is not that much of a margin on necessities. They can't get the money from limiting margins on necessities because they're often already sold at incredibly low prices. The margins that they get are from branded goods. This doesn't apply. I already explained this. The second thing is, like, again, the money that they get in the beginning from the nationalization process, again, it's not infinite, right? It's not going to ever last forever. If you don't make money in the next 10 years, eventually you're going to have to reduce your prices by some other way, which is most likely this particular way. The other way in which I'm going to address CG then, is that when they say that workers can campaign governments for better wages, I think it's just incredibly high burden. I don't think they're ever able to prove this, because bureaucracy barriers still exist in this kind of way. Per OG's own model of civil servants running this, there are still principal agent problems. There are still these kinds of barriers that you run into if you're trying to campaign your boss for lower wages. So I don't think that they're able to access this. The second push of their extension, how this creates emergency supply stocks for crises, and I don't know, you keep stores open when you have to lock down a pandemic. I just want to cast like massive doubt on the likelihood of this, because I also think I want to cast massive doubt on the frequency of this happening, because even if this happens once in a while, even if they're able to claim that this does happen once in a while, I think it's much more infrequent than the kinds of claims they tell you, which is that affordability and the living wages of ordinary people on a day-to-day basis just get fucked on a compounding and exponential way in the long term. Secondly, I think governments already have alternatives in which to feed people in the case of massive lockdowns, or if there's a zombie apocalypse or something, because governments have stocks of things already in the same way that they have stocks of electricity to run generators if there's ever a nationwide electricity crisis. The final thing that they tell us about how luxury goods don't get upcharged anymore either, I don't think this understands anything of what we're trying to tell you, because we're trying to tell you that that's bad. There's no profit, and there's no profit in this kind of thing, which is what unlocks everything that OO wants to talk about efficiency. You're only able to get their claims on efficiency if you understand our explanation of what the stratification of the basket of goods looks like on closing opposition.
Brilliant. I thank opposition whip for my speech. All speakers know what's my today. Leave the room, shake hands, go around, and we'll get